Welcome everyone to our Institute for Ministerial Wholeness webinar. And today I am very happy, pleased, excited, whatever adjective you want to add, to have Dr. Jared Pingleton. And Jared and I go way, way back. And we go back to the fall semester of 1976 when I was beginning my freshman year at Evangel, which is a year I don't even want to go back to. I had way too much fun with a horrible GPA, as Jared and I were just talking about. But Jared was on the opposite spectrum. He was wrapping up his university career as a bachelor student. He graduated in 2 years. He even graduated at the end of the fall semester of 1976 and officially graduated in 77, but just has a lot of gray matter. Just a wonderful fellow too, just so amiable and kind to work with. And we're especially pleased to be able to have him today as we talk about mental health and the ministry. Jared, in his background, is a founding member and continues to serve on the AG Mental Health Committee with the General Council of the Assemblies of God. He's been on staff at numerous large Assemblies of God churches as a psychologist. He also has taught numerous psychology courses at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary and Evangel University. He had grandparents that were actually missionaries to indigenous peoples in the United States. And he himself is a third generation Assemblies of God licensed minister. So he's very well steeped in the Assemblies of God. But I think that besides his family with his wife, Linda, and his 4 sons that are all married with his 5 grandchildren, I think, Jared, probably one of your greatest claims to fame is to have been a member of Crouse First North at then Evangel College. And we all trace our roots back to that momentous time in life.
Absolutely.
Well, we are going to share the screen with you, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Pingleton. What we like to do in our webinars, because for those who come online, we want to give you opportunity to ask questions. So what we like to do is to direct you to the chat box and to write in your question there. And then I will monitor that. And then from that, I will try to get as close to when you ask the question as possible and to share that question with Dr. Pingleton. And then he can respond to it in real time to make sure that your question is answered. And so with that, we're going to go to the PowerPoint that he has, and we'll share that with you. And we'll begin today. So welcome, Dr. Pingleton. Jared from the fall of 1976. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Well, it's a delight to be with you, Mark. Thank you for the invitation, and to the rest of your guests. It's a delight to be with you. As both a clinical psychologist and as a third-generation minister, my heart is particularly moved and sensitive to the fact that we have a global mental health crisis. People are hurting today in epidemic numbers in unprecedented ways. And for the church to really minister effectively to these needs, to me, is one of the most important challenges, and I think moral imperatives that we have before us today. Because the church is filled with real people who have real problems that need real help. And for me, the tragedy is that in the United States, about 80% of persons who are hurting with a mental or relational health issue turn first to their pastor, priest, or rabbi. Now, the irony here is that the majority of the folks in church leadership do not have the time or training to correctly and effectively address those mental and relational health needs. And so for me, that's a real double bind. And what that ironically does, it adds to the kind of iatrogenic or built-in stress that most folks in pastoral leadership are already bearing. To wit, they are the gatekeeper, de facto gatekeeper in mental health ministry, and yet don't have the capacity or the ability to effectively address those needs. And so that stress just gets internalized with many pastors. And so I was moved to create a toolbox to specifically help pastors with these issues. And so this discussion we're going to be sharing today comes primarily from a book that I did a couple of years ago called Mental Health Ministry. And so it is with that we want to take a look. And so um, for these concerns, we see that one of the, again, subtle built-in negative effects is we have 50% of all professionally trained ministers that went to bridal college and cemetery, as you will, they drop out of the profession within the first 10 years. We have a 50% attrition rate just in the first 10 years and 90% attrition over their lifetime. And to me, that's heartbreaking. That's tragic when someone is called to pastor hurting people and shepherd a flock, and yet their stress level is so high that they're not capable or able to fulfill that calling. And we know that, for example, in terms of the ubiquity, the just widespread nature of mental health issues, on the next slide, you'll see that the numbers are staggering.
Joe, any of the guys back there?
Please mute yourselves. That'd be great.
The numbers are staggering. In terms of the scope of the struggle, we see that 1 out of 4 or 5 Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental health illness in any given year, 50% of people over their lifetime. And the numbers for children are almost as high. We see that suicide is epidemic. Globally, we see that it's the #1 mental health issue in the world. And in this country, we see those numbers there, that every 11 minutes someone takes their own life. A big subtle issue in the church that nobody wants to talk about is the widespread addiction of alcohol. 1 out of 8 Americans, not over 12, meet criteria for alcohol use disorder. And nobody talks about that. The denial, even in the church, those numbers, 1 out of 8 people in your congregation meet criteria for alcohol use disorder. And that number is higher in the US than in most other countries around the world, but that's what we deal with in America. Then the pornography, it's not just chemical addiction, but behavioral or process addiction is out of control. We see pornography is 60-80% of males, 40 to 60% of females. And we're seeing gambling addiction just soar with the advent of sports betting, where you can do that online. You can do that by television now, with sports particularly. We're seeing that to be an enormous issue. Then we have prescription medication, where a little old lady gets rear-ended at a traffic signal and pain levels such that her GP prescribes an opioid. Well, we have 300 people every single day in this country dying from an opioid overdose. And those numbers are escalating, particularly with what's not going on at our southern border. So that's a little bit of the issues. And then on the next slide, we see more numbers of the scope of the struggle, that we see that abortion has huge mental health implications. And it's not just 25% of women, it's 25% of men have also had an abortion. The grief, the guilt, the lament, the shame that they experience from that is enormous. We know that almost half of all marriages will end legally. What we don't know is that most of the other half fails functionally. I recently redid a book that I wrote a few years ago and expanded it and revised it, called Making Magnificent Marriages. And in that, I cite some research that shows now 5 to 12% of American marriages are mutually fulfilling. But wait, there's more. Of that 5 to 12%, 90% of those have been married 30 years or longer. And so marriage issues predominate conflict in the church. They are at the core of the family structure. And to see the dynamics and dysfunction of marital problems, to me, that is a huge ministerial low-hanging fruit way that we can address with effective interventions and biblical supports to help alleviate suffering, do psychoeducation to teach people how to be married well. And because of those rates, we see that cohabitation rates are at an all-time high. And the irony is 80% of those break up. Why? Because there's no trust. I mean, what a great pickup line. Hi, I don't trust you and I'm not going to commit to you. Will you live with me? No wonder it doesn't work, right? There's a foundation of proverbial sand there. And that is then the result to why now half of all live births in America are to people who are unmarried. And those numbers are staggering. Imagine a child starting off life with that kind of functional structural insecurity. Well, the odds of every dysfunction and problem are going to be exponentially higher. We know from research that a child born to a single parent has like 20 times greater likelihood of living in poverty, dropout rates, drug addiction rates, delinquency rates, criminality rates, et cetera, just soar. So these are core structural family issues that I think the church needs to be about. We see that as a result, only 1 out of 3 kids in America are going to be raised by both of their parents. The pain of that is stuff that just goes under the radar, and it brings people into clinical offices regularly and unfortunately keeps them from the church. Then another issue that, again, is rarely discussed tragically in the church, and you don't see these people on Mother's Day or Father's Day. 1 out of 6 couples in America are infertile. And I think those numbers are going to escalate because we're seeing the results of particularly the Pfizer shot. I know this is controversial, but we're seeing that that's causing infertility in young women. And I think those numbers are going to be soaring. We're seeing also that low testosterone from microplastics is greatly reducing the fertility of 20 to 30-year-old men. And so that deadly combination, if you will, I think those numbers are going to soar. So that is going to be a huge issue. One of the greatest evils, I think, on our planet is the tragedy that 1 out of 3 girls in this country, and in other countries it's even higher, and 1 out of 4 to 5 boys are sexually abused before age 18. I call childhood sexual trauma raping of the soul, because as bad, evil, and wrong as what happens on the outside is, what happens on the inside is far worse. One's sense of trust is violated. One's sense of innocence is destroyed. One's sense of sexuality is perverted and distorted. And the irony and the evil of what happens to people's self-identity under those circumstances is horrible, because all children internalize things that happen to them, believing it's about them and it's their fault, which it never is and can't be. But that is epidemic again in our culture. Then as adults, we see that at least 1 out of 5 women are assaulted sexually, but most people believe those numbers are actually much greater because of the shame and stigma that accompanies filing a sexual assault charge, because then often the victim is put on trial, as it were. And so people just don't want to face the pain of that. Then we take a look at physical abuse and neglect. 2,000 kids every day in this country experience abuse and neglect. And we don't know how many elderly and or disabled persons that we warehouse away in institutions are also negatively affected by the results of neglect and abuse. The ministry implications to the pain of that are enormous. Then maybe one of the dirtiest secrets of all is 12 million people a year experience domestic violence. And that's a really ugly thing. And even in that statistic, 40% of domestic violence is done by women to men. But because of our sexual disparities and prejudices, I've never seen a shelter for battered husbands, right? And I'm not minimizing the ones for wives by any means. It's just that abuse and violence are destructive to everyone. And then finally, we see that the homeless population, again, prior to the border situation, the majority of those people, it's estimated, are exhibiting and experiencing a mental health crisis. That's a lot. And so that's a little bit of the scope of the struggle that we see in the mental health crisis that we are experiencing. And so for me, I think, again, the ministry opportunities here are enormous. Because think of it this way. Every major city around the globe has a hospital that was named for a denomination, an apostle, or a saint. pretty much the church was the pioneer leading the world in physical health care. And that's a beautiful and appropriate thing. But I'm thinking to myself, why isn't the church similarly being the leader and pioneering mental and relational health care? We have access to people who are hurting. Why is it that we're not helping them well? And so, again, one of the reasons I wrote this toolbox was for pastors and church leaders to be able to have that information available. I kind of view the book as like a Swiss Army knife or a Leatherman multi-tool for pastors and church leaders who don't have the, again, time and training to learn how to deliver appropriate and helpful mental health ministry, but want to give them some tools to be able to do that. But I think before we do that, we have to kind of take a step back and take a look at, okay, what are some of the challenges that we have? And I think there are four primary issues that we can see that have a lot to do with mental health issues just in our culture, much less our Christian subculture. And I think the four challenges we have in ministry to those issues are these. Number one, the silence. It's very difficult to see, well, I guess, first of all, that just the sources of the struggle. Thanks, Mark. Obviously, sin, biochemistry and genetics, negative environment, bad company corrupts good character. Both Solomon and Paul teach faulty learning, dysfunctional families. We learn how to do that. And then, of course, trauma is just guaranteed to create mental health issues. But so in terms of ministry implications, though, I think the four things on the next slide are really, really crucial. And these are how we can diagnose what's going on with people. The first thing is we have to talk about it. There's a sense in which, when we are in denial and we don't talk about things, they typically grow. And then secrecy goes hand in hand with silence. In recovery ministry, in 12-step programs, there's a phrase that says, we are only as sick as our secrets. And so that's built in. And then, of course, we have the sense of shame that is universal. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt is feeling badly for what we do. Shame is feeling guilty for who we are, our sense of identity, personhood, and nature, where, we've been feeling ashamed since Genesis 3, and our immediate instinct is to hide. And Mark, I hope this is okay, but I think one of the best things God ever made was puns. Okay. I really, really love puns. And God obviously does too, because he opens his book with a baseball pun, in the big inning, God created that. And I think that's just awesome. But the second pun in the Bible we see in Genesis 3, where after sin was introduced into the world, God kills some animals and uses their skins to hide Adam and Eve's shame. Yeah. So I just love puns. So, and I know I probably should feel ashamed of that joke, but I won't, and it's okay. But the fourth thing that we take a look at here is the stigma of mental health issues. And so what do we do in ministry? We've got these four intrinsic, inherent challenges. Well, for me, I see every challenge as an opportunity for growth. What if we ended the silence? When I was director of counseling services at Focus on the Family a few years ago, we were able to get a grant to do the biggest research project ever done on mental health in America from a Christian perspective. And so I worked with Lifeway and had Ed Stetzer, who headed them up at the time. I said to Ed, how can we, get the ball down the field with making awareness as a part of this issue? And so what we did is we surveyed 1,000 evangelical pastors from several different brands, my irreverent term for denomination. And we administered a very lengthy survey, and we got a very high rate of return back, almost 100%. And one of the most fascinating returns from that survey was that when a pastor preaches from the pulpit about mental health issues a minimum of one time a year, their congregation was perceived to be 66% healthier from a mental health perspective. That was amazing. The bang for the buck, as it were. So we can end the silence. The second thing I think we have to do with mental health issues is expose the secrecy, to kind of let the Holy Spirit reveal what's hidden. And, unconfessed sin is challenging to experience forgiveness with, right? We know the paradox of when we know the truth, it sets us free. And when we expose our secrets, we have to feel safe to do that. And so I think one of the big challenges in church leadership is making sure that that traditional room where the church met, that really big building was called the, sanctuary. If our church is not a sanctuary, it's not a church. I believe that. A church must be a safe place. And to make a church not just physically, but emotionally healthy and safe is essential for the vitality and vibrance of the gospel to go forth. Jesus made sure people's stomachs were filled before he preached the gospel to them. I think in our culture, we not only have to do that, but we have to make sure that people feel safe to be themselves. And I think because of the ubiquity of spiritual abuse, and it's just becoming rampant. And I know, Mark, you did a great series on that. I think that's so needed. I get people in my office from a clinical point of view that are unchurched, every single day, because of spiritual abuse, because the church was the least safe place they knew of to be able to be themselves and reveal their pain. And so we have to make church a shame-free zone. So we have to eliminate the shame. And then finally, after we end the silence, expose the secrets, eliminate the shame. Fourthly, we have to eradicate the stigma of mental and relational health issues. There are so many derogatory terms, slang words, which people use about mental health issues. And what that does is it causes people to pull in and hide even more. Because when those terms are used, it's not a safe place. Terms like crazy or a nut house or Looney Tunes or loony bins or whatever, all of those stigmas are violent psychologically and spiritually to hurting people. And so what do? Well, in short, when I looked at these issues and I realized the global impact, what the Lord led me to do was to create this resource where I take a look at how to appropriate and deliver mental health issues within the context of ministry. And so I decided to do that on a scale, if you will, of a continuum from least restrictive to most restrictive. And so what I did was I had 10 friends contribute a chapter from the way in which they were doing this well, so that pastors could plug and play, they could hybridize, they could customize, but they wouldn't have to recreate a wheel. And so the thing about these 10 models are that they are multinational, multidisciplinary, multi-denominational, multi-ethnic, and multiracial. And so there's a great variety of different ways in which, in the book, I talk about how churches can appropriate these services. And so I would direct you to that resource for those specifics. But in that way, wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to not be intimidating with all those numbers, but rather give hope and give practical tools. Because as a clinician and as a minister, I'm a pragmatist. I really like stuff that works. And I believe life is short and then we die, and it's too short to experiment or play around with things that may not work. And so it's a very down to earth and very rubber meet the road way to hopefully appropriate ministry. So there's a lot more I can share, but I really am interested in being able to have this be interactive and participative. And so I'd be happy to entertain discussion or questions about how we can move the ball down the field and get the job of ministry done.
So with that, does anybody have a question verbally they would like to ask Dr. Jared Pingleton at this time?
Yes, Dr. Pingleton.
Sure,
My
it's
name's
fine.
Kathy Penton, and I am in Des Moines, Iowa area. And I'm doing some research right now for a doctoral program. And my
Good.
focus is in the Midwest area. And I was directed to a comment to someone you might know, Dr. Ryan Darrow, who came and spoke at the
Yes, I know, right?
Network Council. And he made a comment about people, a study that was being done in the Midwest versus the East-West coach. He pulled his information from a book that's quite dated right now. And but he mentioned the difference in people's emotions and mental health in the Midwest area compared to the East and the West Coast. Do you have any thoughts on that at all, especially when it comes to rural churches where my husband and I pastor, and trying to figure out a passive or understand the passive aggressiveness of people in the Midwest? And that was the comment that was made from a study that was done. So can you comment on that at all? Is there a difference in the area, the culture, the mental health, all of that? Does that make sense?
It really does, Kathy. Thank you for your question. Yes, I think there are incredible differences, not just socioculturally in our country, but certainly globally, about how mental health issues are contextualized, how they're presented, how they're developed, and how they're perpetuated. So yeah, I spent a half a century in Kansas City. I'm a diehard Chiefs Royals and Kansas Jayhawks fan. And I live now in Virginia on the East Coast, and my doctoral program was in LA. So I've certainly experienced all three of the subcultures there that Brian was alluding to. And yeah, I think there are enormous sensitivities that we have to understand. To me, it's sort of like the English language in America, right? There are different dialects and accents that I think analogously we have to appropriate to ministry and certainly to mental health issues. I think to some degree it's dissipating compared to a generation, much less two ago, as our countries become more mobile and people are traveling more and people are from different places. I think as people move around more, that is diminishing. But I think certainly, yeah, that's a subcultural sensitivity to which we must be oriented in order to effectively appropriate. Now, you raise another variable there as well, Kathy, and that's a rural congregation as opposed to an urban or suburban congregation. And again, these are all generalizations, but I think there are enough truths in a generalization that we would do well to be aware of. And so I think another factor in the socioeconomic construction or constitution of a congregation has to do with educational level. I think often rural people are often less well formally educated. And so I think for them, ministry needs to be practical nuts and bolts more frequently than perhaps in an urban setting. And so I think having wisdom and the Holy Spirit's guidance and sensitivity to looking at how Jesus addressed different audiences with his word pictures, his parables, analogies, etc., to communicate and convey the truth is a wise way to connect with people. So I think part of that relies on what we would call EQ, emotional quotients, to where we're able to have a sensitivity to the people we're serving and a way to connect, help with them for that.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy. Great question. Anyone else has something like to ask? Let me ask a question that kind of ties into what Kathy asked. When it comes to the diversity that we have in our churches today, especially I would say in urban and then suburban areas, but you also see Muslims in small town America too. But have you noticed that within certain ethnic groups, racial groups, that mental health issues and the way that those are addressed need to be done differently, the same. Um, one size
Absolutely. Yeah.
isn't necessarily true, I would think.
Great question. And that's part of the reason why I felt led to include, how mental health services are delivered in different countries and within different denominations, racial and ethnic populations and so on. And to me, that's why what's on the screen is so vital, because I think the variables really are these four, as to, in some subcultures, shame is a greater issue than others. Many Asian cultures, for example, shame is the number one issue here that's just glaring. And then, of course, in different cultures, they vary. So I think as long as we have an ear to the ground on these four dynamics of silence, secrecy, shame, and stigma, and apply those to the population with whom we're working, I think that is going to probably be the best key that I would know of, Mark, to your question. Because I think those are transcultural. I think these four dynamics are global, and I think they're human. And there will be variability, I think, among the people groups with whom we're serving, but I do think that that question is probably best addressed within that context of these four dynamics.
Right. I know from our experience in Pakistan and Central Asia, these four would keep people who have a person in their family that has mental illness hidden away. They wouldn't see the light of day just because of these things that are part of it being, in Muslim context, seen as almost like a curse from Allah or something such as that. So, but then that manifests itself in other cultures around the world too. And maybe the nomenclature is different, but still the silence, secrecy, shame, and stigma are consistent. So I really love what you're sharing here, because it really is a global type of grid paradigm to run through.
Yeah, and I think in ministry, our challenge then, Mark, is how do we shine light, speak truth, and spread salt into a darkened, decaying, and diluted world? And I think, when we have that, because to me, ministry is both a mindset and a mission. When we have that mindset, then I think our mission to say, 25% of the population at any given time is struggling with a mental health issue. This isn't, oh, not in my church, not in my ministry realm. No, this is everywhere. And 50% of people over their lifespan. So let's start with silence. When pastors are able to self-disclose appropriately their struggle, their humanness, their fallenness, their pain, their anxiety, their depression, their bipolarity, whatever their issues are, then when that silence is eliminated, what happens in the congregation is, wow, I can relate to him or her. I have experienced those issues. I know someone who's struggling with that concern. And what that does is it refreshes the entire population of that ministry impact, to where people are no longer defensive, they're no longer hiding, they're no longer afraid, they're no longer thinking I'm the only one. There is a dynamic in group psychotherapy we know of called universality, that when we realize, wow, I'm not the only one, that's so healing in and of itself. And so I think, to me, that's true leadership. When we have that mindset that dictates then our mission to say, okay, Lord, how do we appropriate the Isaiah prophecy where the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me and he's anointed me to preach good news to people who are chained up, people who are broken, people who don't have a visual capacity to see what they're doing to themselves or others. I mean, if we think of those dynamics in Isaiah's prophecy of Jesus' mission, if we think of those not just literally, but also figuratively, I mean, people who are in prison, boy, that's addiction. That's addiction. Those people are imprisoned by their addiction. And so, I think that can help us with our mission when we look at our mindset to say, how do we address these concerns effectively?
Thank you. All right, if there are no other questions, we'll move forward. But again, if you do have a question that comes up while Dr. Jared Pingleton is presenting, just go ahead and put it in the chat box and we'll address it.
Well, one of the things I want us to consider today are a list of 10 things that ministry leaders can do as part of their focus, moving toward their future of how they can deliver different models and methods of mental health ministry. And so I'll just kind of run through those 10 things here. The first is to value mental and relational health. And sorry, this is going to be a different slide, Mark. So the rest of that presentation are different things. Well, we can go through those. Those are fine too. I just thought for this group, a different thing would be good, but let's go back. I think 4 things we can do that are really operationalizing love is compassion, because empathy, when you look at that term, I love etymology, and you break that word in half. The prefix come means with, passion means deep feeling. If we minister with deep feeling, as Jesus did, that's going to end the silence. And those verses there, it's interesting. We see the Father being described as a God of compassion, and then we see Jesus' ministry often being motivated and moved by compassion. When he supernaturally intervened with hurting people, it was with a motivation of compassion. And so what are ministry models there? Trained lay counselors in small groups are a way to compassionately reach hurting people in the congregation, in the local church, because that shows hurting people that you care. In a church that doesn't have those kinds of ministries available, often people don't feel a sense of compassion. The church my wife and I go to here in Lynchburg, Virginia, is called Compassion Church. And boy, they've got all kinds of groups and interventions to show hurting people that care. And so the second form of kind of dealing with the solution ends the secrecy. So the compassion ends the silence. But the next slide talks about how do we end the secrecy? And that's with a sense of community, because that's love is relationship. And these verses take a look at, and if, by the way, anybody wants this, PowerPoint, I'll be happy to send it to you. Just let me know, email me, or you can reach me at my website too, drpingleton.com. But community is about relationship. And when you live in relationship with people, no longer are secrets being held. They get exposed and hopefully loved, and you get grace and mercy. And so support groups and recovery programs are the epitome of community. That's what they're designed to do. It's how they function. It's their kind of DNA, if you will. And so those are the ways that ministry can take place in terms of facilitating, developing, and encouraging community. And when that takes place, there are no more secrets. Those are exposed. And then the third thing that we can do ministerially on the next slide has to do with our sense of shame, which then can be erased, because that's counseling. Because one of the ways to think about counseling is it's actually intimate personal discipleship. Okay, it's about how to be trained in living life and relationships well. And so Scripture talks so much about counseling, and we know that in pastoral counseling and certainly with licensed mental health clinicians, if we took a discipleship mentality and mindset to that ministry, the shame just gets wiped away. It's erased. And that to me is a very beautiful, powerful dynamic. And I know that, in many effective, healthy churches now, there are trained counselors or trained pastoral counselors, lay counselors set up to do that kind of work. And then finally, to eradicate and eliminate the stigma, we see that the fourth solution to the struggle of mental health is that it takes courage. To me, courage is love in action. And to me, the difference between theory and practice is whether or not we have the courage to implement the theory, okay? One way to think about those first 3 solutions to the struggle is those are all great theory, but it takes guts to really come alongside people who are hurting. It can feel intimidating. When we get a personally involved relationship built in, and here's where we take a look at maybe more intensive ways or models and methods of ministry, whether that's a residential program or a day treatment program or inpatient hospitalization, particularly for people with severe substance abuse addiction or severe mental health issues. It takes a lot of courage to love people well through those kinds of life challenges. And so again, scripture talks of very much, these are passages that talk about the courage to confront and involve ourselves in our own issues and the pain of others. And so these are ways that we can really, in the church, make a significant difference to hurting people, both individually and congregationally. And so if there are questions or comments about those, I'd be happy to entertain them. Okay, well, beyond those, I wanted to share a list of 10 other things to this audience as folks in ministry leadership that I believe are also incredibly useful, helpful, and powerful in mental health ministry. And the first of these, number one, would be to value mental and relational health. And there are a lot of ways we can do that. Role modeling is the best, of course, as we know. And so for that reason, I had the pastor, a friend of mine down in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, who pastors a multi-site megachurch, share his personal story of when he was burned out and then the sabbatical that he finally took and now requires all of his church staff members to likewise involve themselves with. He values mental health so much that he has consultants like me come down for a week and do in-service training and then spend time with each staff member and their spouse on a regular basis to value their own mental health, because what does he know? He knows he can't lead other people where he himself has not been. And he can't give that which he does not have. And I think often in professional ministry, particularly in missions ministry, people often feel guilty for taking time and energy and resources for their own health. But we know intuitively, if we're running a tow truck service and we don't keep our own battery charged, we're not going to be able to jumpstart anybody else. We know intuitively, if we're standing in a soup line feeding starving people, if we don't eventually take some of that food for our own sustenance, we're going to eventually fall over and not be able to help people at the end of the line. And we know those things intuitively, as I said, but pragmatically, that's a little more of a challenge. But I think we take a look at our values. Do we value our own mental and relational health? Do we prioritize our own marriage relationships, our own family systems in a way that is meaningful? So we've got a couple of minutes here. Let me tell you a story about one of my best friends, who was my pastor for 42 years in Kansas City. Bill Newby is a wonderful man. And he was telling a story one day. His dad was also a pastor, and they went to a small town in Oklahoma where his dad had been invited to try out to be their lead pastor. And so he remembered this story. He said, my dad got up and he says, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I know after the sermon, you're going to have a potluck lunch and then vote on whether or not you call me to be your pastor. And I appreciate this opportunity. But before you vote, I want you to know some things about me. He said, if you call me to be your pastor, I want you to know that my number one priority will be to make sure I do everything I know how to make sure I go to heaven. My number two priority will be to make sure I do everything I know how to do to bring that pretty lady, that blonde lady on the front row over there with me. My third priority will be, after that, I will do everything I know how to do to make sure I'm going to bring those two little boys sitting next to her with us. Now, if I have any time and energy left over after that, I'll be glad to be your pastor. And I thought that was one of the most brilliant boundary setting dynamics I've ever heard in professional ministry. And oh, by the way, Bill said his dad didn't get 2 a.m. calls from Mrs. Smith who couldn't sleep, to pray for her, because they knew the prioritizations that he set up front about valuing his own mental and relational health. And Bill said, my dad was there for every game. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to climb a tree, how to shoot a gun, how to fly a kite, how to throw a ball. My dad was a great dad. Now, you've never heard of him because he was not a mega church pastor, but boy, I think he knocked out of the park this first point of valuing his own mental and relational health and those of his own family. The second thing, after valuing our own and our in general mental and relational health and making it a priority for those whom we lead, the second thing is to proclaim the truth. I think we need to speak the truth about mental and relational health needs, like all those stats. Those are facts, those are reality, and those need to be a part of teaching and preaching, because the Bible is far from silent on any or all of these issues. We need to do the proper exegetical and hermeneutical work to then proclaim the truth. And I just think that's essential. The third thing that we must do is then lead by example. Preaching's easy, practicing is hard. We all know that. We all struggle with that. I know I do. The guy that uses my toothbrush can preach a lot easier than he practices. And so I think, though, when we make that as a priority, it not only helps us with humility, but it helps us with credibility. Because I know when I'm tempted to throw rocks at people that I'm judging, and the damage and destruction that does to them and makes me unsafe for them, that breaks God's heart, and it doesn't help them any either. And so I think leading by example doesn't mean that we spill our guts with everything. Obviously, we have to be judicious and wise. We need to, be as aware as a snake and as innocent as a bird, as it were. But by example, we can even institutionalize example. Like, again, my pastor friend in Kannapolis, North Carolina, has institutionalized every 7 years, every staff member gets a paid sabbatical. And that's leading by example. That's saying that the mental health of your church's leadership is so valuable that we are taking these proactive measures. And oh, by the way, when their needs need to be met in a crisis, they pay for that person or couple or family to get the help they need. And so leading by example is not just by speech, but it's by policy. Okay. And so I think having this sense of values being let out is a big deal. From that, then, fourthly, stems naturally another point that's important, and that's to create a culture. I think as Christian leaders, we're realizing more in the last half a generation how important culture creation is to the health and vitality of the church. And yes, it is a culture that we create and or promote, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And so why don't we get upstream from that and be proactive about creating a culture that says we don't do shame and stigma here with mental and relational health issues. We don't make fun of people. We don't hide them because of secrecy, and we don't ignore them about silence. When we're having anxiety struggles, we can pray for, and here's a pet peeve soapbox. Is it okay, Mark, to do a pet peeve soapbox? Okay. Okay. In the church, we can pray for Aunt Mabel's lumbago. And I've never had lumbago, so I'm sure it's not fun. But how many people have you heard pray to say, pray for my kleptomania temptation? The difference between a kleptomaniac and a literalist? A literalist is one who takes things literally, and a kleptomaniac is one who takes things literally. But I mean, we're too ashamed to say, yeah, I'm tempted to steal stuff. But why can't we pray for that when that's our struggle? You hear what I'm saying? So I think creating a culture that says, we're going to love you just like you are, but too much to keep you this way is a wonderful and refreshing thing. And I think it would reduce the pastoral counseling load greatly when people feel free to say, hey, sinners are welcome here because we all mess up. And so I think compassionately caring, not condoning, please hear me, I'm not condoning sin, I'm not condoning dysfunction, I'm not condoning abuse, neglect. When we compassionately give warmth and grace and mercy along with corrective healing, then that's a wonderful thing. Let me soapbox about another issue that is a culture we can help create. We don't hear sermonizing about taking chemotherapy or taking medication for diabetic conditions. But why then, or people having visual correction, with their myopia, if they just had more faith or prayed about it, they wouldn't be nearsighted. Really? Yeah, we don't do that. But we do that so much with mental and relational health issues. If you just read the Bible more, if you just pray more, if you just go to church more, then you wouldn't have this mental health issue. Now, I'm not opposed to praying more, reading the Bible more, and going to church more, but sometimes there are issues we need medication, we need treatment, we need help with. And so I would love to see the church have a culture that then could be created. And a fifth way to bring that about, again, these are kind of sequential. The fifth thing that we can do in Christian leadership is to provide biblical examples. David was absolutely bipolar. There's no doubt about it. One third of the Psalms, he's depressed, he's furious. They're called the imprecatory Psalms. That's a nice theological word for he's dying inside. He's spilling his guts and he's yelling at God. And, so he's in the pits of despair. And then he's dancing naked downtown Jerusalem, exulting and exalting God's holiness in an uninhibited way. He's like Swiss Alps, right? On an MMPI. He's all over the place. Paul was as OCD as anybody you'll ever meet. He was so obsessive compulsive, and God used him anyway. See, here's my point. God is not impressed with our pathology. He's really not. He uses broken vessels. All of us have issues. I bet even Mark has some issues. I know, if he didn't, going to Crouse First North created some. But we've got to look at biblical examples. Here's what I love about Scripture. The Bible never whitewashes or sanitizes its heroes. All the people in Scripture had issues. For us to judge them? No. For us to fault find? Absolutely not. To give us hope because we all have issues. And so if we can reframe the gospel, I think it actually increases, not diminishes its power, because our heroes had feet of clay. And that's what I love about the Old Covenant Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11. That's quite a motley crew there. I mean, you're talking people that, we're talking incest, we're talking murder, we're talking adultery, we're talking sexual assault. That's not what they're remembered for. What are they known for? Their faith. And so providing and preaching biblical examples is, I think, a very wonderful way to do this. Sixth, here's some practical low-hanging fruit we can conduct seminars and workshops. When we held community mental health seminars for marriage, for anxiety, for depression, not only did it reduce the shame and stigma in the churches I served, but what it did was it attracted people from the community. And what we found out? It was an enormous evangelical outreach. It was a literal mission of the church. People started coming to the church. It wasn't a knocking on the door, in the neighborhood kind of approach. It was saying, this is a place of healing. This is a place of resource. This is a place of information and help. And you know what? People came. The church just surged in growth when we opened a counseling center and started delivering psychoeducational services. People came and they became known, those churches in the community, as a resource center rather than a place of judgment. So seminars and workshops, whether you invite outside experts in or have trained local people to do it, really doesn't matter. It's getting the truth out in an appropriated way that lands and impacts and transforms and redeems broken lives and relationships. Folks, it is such a powerful ministry model. One of the most creative things that I've ever been a part of, a dear friend of mine in Kansas City, whose 93rd birthday was last week, Dr. George Westlake, who for 60 some years was pastor of an inner city, multicultural, multiracial AG church. I think it was the first AG megachurch in an inner city in the country. Sheffield Family Life Center in Kansas City. He innovated a fabulous concept with me, and we took it around to different churches actually in the Kansas City area. On a Friday night, we would have people come at 7 o'clock, and we issued them 3x5 blank note cards, very low tech, and a pencil. So nobody could tell who wrote the question, and they would submit the question on marriage or on parenting and fold it in half and give it to an usher, and they brought them down, and we sat at a table, George and me, and sometimes a female counselor, and we would talk about marriage. We would talk about parenting. We would talk about mental health issues. And at 10:30, the nursery workers would knock on the door and say, hey, you guys are going to have to stop because your kids are getting sleepy and cranky. We need to go home. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people came, and that's all we did was a panel discussion. It was so vibrant and vital. It was so healthy. And people, I mean, we talked about everything there is to talk about sexuality in the church. I mean, everything without exception, except for necrophilia. I don't think that came up, but bestiality did, and pretty much everything you can imagine. And it was healthy, because there's a basic difference between healthy people, couples, families, and churches, and unhealthy people, couples, and families, and churches. And it's simply this: healthy people, couples, families, and churches talk out their feelings and issues. Unhealthy people act out their feelings and issues. That's why silence comes first in that list of the 4 concerns we have to address. And so for me, that's a very simple way to kind of get the ball down the field, where we do it in-house, literally. So the 7th thing that I want to encourage is to offer support groups. I think the church is the ideal place for grief share, for divorce recovery, for childhood sexual trauma abuse groups, for Celebrate Recovery, for substance abuse issues of all kinds, et cetera. And I think support groups in the church naturally go together. 8th, create a resource center. Have a library of books and online resources, brochures, et cetera, about mental and relational health. Have hotline numbers. Have referral networks, and the AG has a referral network I helped develop. We borrowed one I developed to focus on the family, and on the back of your ministry credential card, there is a QR code. You can scan that. It takes you right to the AG mental health website, and there are vetted mental health therapists nationwide that in every ministry network you can appropriate. And so having that resource center for people where they can go for help and find help literally within the church is such a low-hanging fruit necessity. Number 9, partner and collaborate. I think it's really wise for a pastor to get to know some mental health professionals in their community, take them out to lunch or breakfast, get to know them, see what makes them tick, find out who they are, find out what they believe, find out what their specialties are, so you can refer with confidence when you're in over your head. Collaborate with treatment facilities and mental health centers in your community, in your state, in your area, or in your country, worldwide, to where you can give people with confidence, knowing I would send a relative to that person or that place. And then 10th, finally, practice hospitality. If there's one thing that I think people who are struggling with mental and relationship health issues need more than anything else, is connection with other people. And when we're hospitable, when we welcome the stranger, when we entertain the hurting, again, the word hospital is derived from hospitality or vice versa. Those two terms etymologically have the same root. And so when we're a hospital for sinners instead of a museum for saints, we're gonna get the gospel out and lived in hurting people's lives.
Jared, thank you so much. All of this was just excellent. And I'm so glad that it's recorded, because many people do the webinars that can't be on because they're in different time zones around the world. But before we adjourn today, a couple things. One, if you have a question in mind, please feel free to ask it. I think all the points at the beginning, the 4 primary, and then going into these last 10 are so applicable at every level, whether it's in the church in the United States or whether it's on the mission field as well. And I did want to make sure that we addressed any questions that came. And a comment that came in from a friend, Jackie Ranger, was this: second generation immigrants that grow up in America and their parents has double the difficulty. I think what she's writing, and I do this all the time, they have double the difficulty. That second person has more issue with family and culture than it does with family structure, and then living in an American culture. Any comments to that, Jared? Did that make sense?
It makes tremendous sense, Mark. And even as we were discussing yesterday, third and even second culture kids have enormous challenges with identity, with roots, with a sense of stability and structure. Who, what, and where is home? Who am I? Am I, by birth of this nationality? Am I by culture from this country? Those are profound identity questions. And I think those are endemic to foreign missions. And so again, I think the issue is, how do we talk about those things at home? And how do we determine and describe our identities so that our children and grandchildren or extended family can connect? And how do we maintain connections with others that we choose to live healthy relationships with or by? So yes, Jackie, that is a vital question with enormous sets of issues with huge implications, because the second and third culture dynamics are very challenging. At the same time, I would encourage you to also reframe that picture. I remember in art appreciation class at Evangel, the prof was talking about, a different frame changes not the painting, but the way we perceive the painting, right? Figure, ground, shading, perspective, focal points, all of the science dynamics of art. And so with second and third cultures for missions, I want to encourage you to think about this. The advantages of having a second and third culture are enormous. They're not ethnocentric by nature, typically. They're able to be more flexible and social by interacting with people of differences of many kinds, whether on the inside or the outside, different colors, different languages, etc. So I would encourage them to look not only at the kind of obvious challenges of secondary and tertiary cultures, but the advantages and the benefits, because I think they're enormous. The education that children get from looking at the same realities from different perspectives culturally, I think those are great strengths. And so I would encourage you to help them look at the glass being more than half full, not just the empty parts of that.
Very good. And it's so true when it comes to cross culture. And I was even thinking, within our own cultures, we have, in context, we have in the United States so many peoples coming from around the world. And if we're going to engage people from other places in the world that we would even send missionaries, we need to be thinking about how we can minister to them in the area of mental health also. And so you've addressed that. And it's an awareness, is an area that many times in the local church in the United States we don't think about. But here's a whole other venue of engaging unreached people and touching their lives. We have another comment here. As someone who leads a homeless mission and pastors a small rural church, this is life transforming information. Thank you. Well, Jay Bent, thank you for making that comment. It's very helpful to get positive feedback like that. Well, our time is up for today, and I just want to let you all know that when we conclude this recording, we will then sometime this afternoon have it put on our Institute for Ministerial Wholeness website, imw.org, and go to events archives, and you'll see that it'll be slotted in there so that you can go back to the webinar and perhaps reference things that you wanted to rehearse. Or if you want to recommend it to other people, we also would suggest that you do that as well. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to Dr. Jared Pingleton for taking his time and being with us today. It was just an excellent presentation and great questions from all of you that were able to be on with us. And thank you for joining us. And so we look forward to being with you the next time, which is going to be October the 7th. It's going to be a unique day. I believe October the 7th is earlier in the week, not a Wednesday, and it will be at noon. And we are going to be having Tim and Eve Austin. Tim and Eve. Tim is a coach and Eve is a counselor. I know this couple well. I served them as their area director when they were missionaries in Tajikistan, and they were model missionaries and just an excellent couple. And we are going to be talking about going on pilgrimage. They just came from doing El Camino in Spain, and we're going to talk about that. But we're also, with the Institute for Ministerial Wholeness, we are also going to be planning on doing a pilgrimage where we want to invite those that are a part of the Institute and beyond to join us on pilgrimage, where we can allow the Lord to speak into our lives as we journey together in a unique place, visiting sites where early Christians have worshiped and been a part and have a deep spiritual heritage. And I don't know about you, but when I get away from a setting I'm familiar with, I can hear from the Lord so much more clearly. So we'll be talking a lot about that, the benefits of pilgrimage. So October the 7th, and we'll be promoting that. If you haven't signed up for our Institute for Ministerial Wholeness newsletter, please do. We send it out every month, and we push all the information out, all the webinars. Jared, we'd love to have you back again. I hope that you'd be willing.
Oh, absolutely. It's a delight to be with you all. Thanks, Mark.
And again, the book is Mental Health Ministry. The struggle is real. So please order this. Jared, how can they order this? Where can they get this?
You can get it at a discount on my website, drpingleton.com, or online anywhere.
Okay, very good. And spell your last name for everyone, because I have to think twice.
Pingleton, drpingleton.
Pingleton, just like it sounds. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. God bless you. And if there's any way we can serve you at the Institute, please be sure to write us. God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.